Good evening and welcome to all who are joining us for our session on why Iowa is so white. My name is Meg Wagner and I'm an Episcopal priest and I serve in the Diocese of Iowa at Beloved Community Initiative in Iowa City. Beloved Community Initiative is a ministry of the Episcopal Diocese of Iowa that's focused on racial justice, healing, and reconciliation. We are so blessed to have several interfaith partners in that work. And joining me tonight to co-host our guest speaker is one of those partners, a friend of mine, Pastor Anthony Smith. Pastor Smith, why don't you introduce yourself and then welcome our guest speaker. You got to go ahead and unmute though.
Welcome again. My name is Pastor Anthony Smith. I'm the pastor of New Creations International Church. Also, I lead the Johnson County Interfaith Coalition, and our focus is social justice. We are a organization that is comprised of about 18 organizations that are faith-based and some community-based organizations for social justice, and just glad to be here tonight. Want to introduce our speaker, host for the evening. Dr. Chuck Connerly is a professor and serves as the director of school planning and public affairs at the University of Iowa. His most recent book, Green, Fair, and Prosperous: Paths to Sustainable Iowa, is an assessment of Iowa's sustainability and of challenges and responses. Dr. Connerly also wrote The Most Segregated City in America: City Planning and Civil Rights in the Challenges and Responses. Dr. Connerly also, in Birmingham from 1920 to 1980. That book was named one of the top 10 planning books in 2006 by Plantazian. In 2007, the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning named the book a recipient of the Paul Daviat Award, which recognizes an outstanding book publication promoting participatory planning and positive social change, opposing poverty and racism as factors in society, and seeking ways to reduce disparities between rich and poor, white and black, men and women. He is also a member of the Johnson County Interfaith Core Team at the Congregational United Church of Christ in Iowa City. Please welcome Dr. Chuck Connerly.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Pastor Smith and Pastor Wagner. And I'm really glad to be here. So why don't we get started? So yes, as you know, the topic for tonight is the question, why is Iowa so white? And I'm trying to change slides. Hang on. There we go. And this is a chapter from the book that I wrote that was just named, that was published by the University of Iowa Press in September of 2020. So give a little shameless plug there. So Iowa, and as obviously as we all know, Iowa's in the Midwest, and Iowa and the Midwest have been in the news a lot. Certainly 2020 was a year in which the Midwest figured in the news because of what happened with the murder of George Floyd in this part of Minneapolis, Minnesota, which we see right here. And of course, the Midwest was central to the election of 2020 as well. So in part, we're talking about the Midwest, but certainly we're talking a lot about Iowa tonight. Why do we conceive of Iowa and really the Midwest as so white? Well, part of it's the numbers, but also part of it's the image. If you look at the numbers, and this is an article from Little Village magazine a couple of months ago, titled "The Demure White Supremacy of the Midwest," and talking about the fact that Midwest is more white and less black, and particularly in more rural states like Iowa, and fewer foreigners as well. So the numbers do suggest that both Iowa and the Midwest are more white than really much of the rest of the country. But also there's the image. There's this image that when we talk about the Midwest, where some people say, and this was certainly the implication again, going back to the 2020 election, 2016 election, when the Midwest was quote unquote lost in 2016, but it was because of the white voters. And this is an article from the New York Times 3 years ago now, with the title, "Stop Pretending Black Midwesterners Don't Exist." And just read the quote here. "The so-called flyover states have long been an avatar for the real America. Small towns," I think she means real facetiously, by the way, "small towns, country music, conservatism, casseroles, and amber waves of grain. Whiteness there. It is that mythologized heartland that pundits seem to think will engender empathy, not the Black families of Milwaukee, the majority Latino community of Dodge City, Kansas, the Burmese Chin refugees of Indianapolis, or the strong Arab community of metropolitan Detroit." So she's saying that part of the Midwest and presumably Iowa as well, being seen as white is based on perception as well as the numbers. So this leads me to talk about and think about, the invisibility of non-white people in Iowa in the Midwest. If people think of the Iowa as being white, then the people who aren't white are invisible, which, suggests the famous book that came out in 1952, classic by Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man. And this is a suggestive cover from, I think it's the Penguin version of the book, of the protagonist, the book coming out from the underground. And he writes, Ralph Ellison writes at the beginning of the book, "I am an invisible man. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me." And this is a memorial to, the statue is a memorial to, or sculpture is a memorial to Ralph Ellison in New York City, designed by one of his biggest fans, Elizabeth Catlett. And we see there the invisible man in her sculpture. Elizabeth Catlett, by the way, got her MFA at the University of Iowa, as did, I'm not sure she got an MFA, but as did Ralph Ellison's wife, Fanny Ellison. And a few years ago, several of my colleagues wrote a book about invisibility at the University of Iowa, looking at the history of African Americans from the 1930s really till the early 1960s, and their role particularly in athletics and the arts, as the university began to become a little bit more diverse, but sharing the invisibility that we're talking about here. So Iowa, with its Native American or American Indian, Black, Hispanic, or Asian, what we might call a diaspora, people who've come from other places or been here, such as American Indians, and moved to other places. Part of that story is a story of both of diversity and increasing diversity, but also invisibility. And this is something I write in the book. One can drive through the state of Iowa or walk through the University of Iowa campus, as I have, and not see a single African American or Latinx, unless you're a member of those groups, not think about it. In other words, the state's whiteness makes the diaspora, these people who have moved here from other places or been relocated from here, makes them invisible, makes the diaspora invisible. Such as diversity and invisibility in Iowa. Since statehood in 1846, Iowa has been largely white. As recently as 2017, Iowa was the nation's 6th whitest state by percentage, and the whitest state in the Midwest. The other states that are whiter are not in the Midwest, as you see here. In 1850, whites comprised 99.8% of the new state's population. By more than 100 years later, by 1970, for the first time, the state's population, the white population, dipped below 99% for the first, as I said, for the first time. So since 1970, Iowa is still largely white, but it is becoming more diverse. But at the same time, many parts are still predominantly white. It's interesting that really the fastest growing population groups are non-white. So from 2000 to 2019, the state's white population grew by 5.5%. But for African American, Asian, and Hispanic populations, the percentages 72, 93, and 140 are much higher. It's interesting because the state has been challenged by population growth for a long time. The growth really are in non-white populations, but the question becomes really one of the key questions is, how does Iowa successfully become a more diverse state so it can both attract population but also join the 21st century and join the global world, which is a much more diverse world than Iowa is. So how did Iowa become a predominantly white state? Well, the answer, of course, is pretty easy to figure out. It was taken away from Native Americans by white European heritage settlers who were moving to the U.S. Obviously a rapidly growing nation. The U.S. population grew by a third every decade between 1790 and 1860. And so there was a lot of pressure for westward movement. But it was not only demographic, but it was also because of U.S. policy. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson wrote the new territorial governor, Indiana territory governor, William Henry Harrison. And Iowa at that time, which was part of the Louisiana Purchase, was part of Indiana territory. And Jefferson writes Harrison to say, Jefferson predicted that when American Indians accumulated debts in their trade with white people, they would be willing, in his words, to lop them off, that is the land, lop off the debts by a cession of lands. In so doing, Jefferson had hoped that Indians would give up their desire for access to what he considered to be extensive forest and vast lands, but would instead turn to small-scale agriculture. So almost from the very beginning, as soon as Iowa became part of, as a territory, part of the United States, the President of the United States had plans for what to do with Native Americans, not only in Iowa, but in the Midwest. And 1 year later, in 1804, Harrison induced a small group of Sauk and Meskwaki men to sign a treaty giving up what you see here in the yellow, a vast portion of Northwest Illinois, and then smaller parts of Missouri, and then southwestern Wisconsin. In Iowa, at least 14 Native American nations have lived in one place or another. This is a map prepared by the University of Iowa showing where various Indian nations, Indian tribes have lived over time. The orange dots are the Meskwaki, whom we know live in Tama or near Tama right now in their settlement there. And then the sort of greenish near the Meskwaki, near the red, are the Sauk, and they spent a lot of time with each other. But there are also other Native American nations here, including the Iowa in the light blue, for whom the state is named. This is, given the concept of diaspora that we're talking about, the Meskwaki and the Sauk came a long way to Iowa. They were in the the river, what's the name of the river valley? I'm blanking on it. The St. Lawrence River Seaway. That's right, St. Lawrence River area in Canada and northeastern United States, and gradually moved to Michigan, and then to Michigan, and then to Wisconsin. And by the 18th century, 1700s, began to move into Illinois and Iowa in this light green area right here. And in the 19th century, the first half of the 19th century, the Sauk and Meskwaki expanded their territory to what you see in the middle slide, which is about 1825, where they pretty much dominated the entire state. But by 1842, as European Americans began to move into the state, their area of territory was getting smaller and would shrink to basically nothing. Of course, a lot of that was sped up by the what one author has titled the Battle for the Heart of America, the Black Hawk War. The Sauk and Meskwaki were typically in villages, their own villages, but they were often nearby each other. Some of the villages were in Illinois on the western side of the Mississippi. Some of them were on the eastern side of the Mississippi. So their fates were intertwined. This is a portrait of Chief Black Hawk, and who had denied actually, I don't think he was a chief. I should correct that. This is a portrait of Black Hawk, who denied the Treaty of 1804 that we just mentioned a few minutes ago, and the follow-up 1816 treaty, which also ceded lands, even though he signed it. He denied those, and he eventually decided to do something about the fact that he and his Sauk and Meskwaki, or particularly the Sauk, had been told that they needed to relocate to the west side of the river, west side of the Mississippi River in Iowa, whereas they preferred to be, he preferred to be in his village of Saukenuk, which is in where modern day Rock Island is located. So in spring of 1832, he and about 2,000 primarily Sauk, including warriors, women, children, and old men, crossed the Mississippi River from Iowa back into Illinois, and then began a series of skirmishes that was later deemed to be the Black Hawk War, which travel up the Rock River. The skirmishes travel up the Rock River into Wisconsin and end very badly up the northern Mississippi River between Wisconsin and Iowa, and ended very badly in basically a massacre for the Sauk there. Black Hawk does escape, but the penalty that both the Sauk and the Meskwaki had to pay for it was what was called the Black Hawk Purchase, which was the eastern part of Iowa, as you can see right here. I don't remember how many millions of acres, but a lot of land that was then opened up in 1832 for white Europeans to move into. And these were that so-called purchase, which it was, but it was a forced purchase, was followed by a series of purchases. This was an area right here. I think we can find Iowa City, but Johnson County was sort of part of this, actually at the upper end of what was called Keokuk's Reserve. Johnson County, I think, is in this area right here. So in the late 1830s, Johnson County is an important part of the series of progressions moving westward. So a series of land cessions resulted in basically Native Americans being, in a few short years, less than 30 years, being forced to leave the state of Iowa. So in other words, Indians in Iowa were everywhere, but are by the 1850s nowhere in effect. Therefore, well, not in effect, but actually they were made invisible. Except throughout the state. The irony of this all is that while Native Americans were kicked out, the image of Native Americans has adorned many high schools and other, including the university. Iowa Hawkeyes, just the name Iowa is named after the Iowa, and Hawkeye is partly an allusion to Black Hawk as well. Black Hawk County, as you can see, has adopted was almost undoubtedly named after Black Hawk, the Sauk Indian, but they've adopted a Black Hawk as their symbol there. But the Meskwaki decided they wanted to come back. And so the story, it was not complete eradication of Native Americans. The Meskwaki wanted to come back. They wanted to be on the Iowa River. And so they were able to, using the money that they had earned from selling their land, to buy about 80 acres of land on the Iowa River next to Toledo and Tama, Iowa. And since then, that has grown into 8,000 acres. So there is part of the, this story is one of Native Americans being evacuated, being disappeared, but there was also resilience here as well, and certainly the resilience of the Meskwaki, who didn't want to leave and came back to Iowa. This graphic is from a fine dissertation by Eric Zimmer, the University of Iowa. So anyhow, Iowa, as you can imagine, white Europeans who didn't really care much for Native Americans and really wanted them to be out of the way, had similar feelings towards to African Americans, because as we all know, Iowa was next to Missouri, and Missouri was a slave state. Slavery, as Missouri became more populated, the number of African Americans living in Missouri grew quite significantly, as from about 25,000 in 1830 to almost 120,000 by the eve of the Civil War. And one of the early European settlers, a Dubuque lead mining businessman, speaking in 1844 in favor of a law that would keep blacks out of Iowa, said, upon the borders of a slave state, and I'm having a hard time reading my slides because I'm trying to move the, there we go, trying to move the text, sorry. Upon the borders of a slave state, and if we had not something to keep them out, that is African Americans, in this case, weren't actually runaway slaves, we should have all the broken down Negroes of Missouri overrunning us. So interestingly, Langworthy's family had attempted to move into Iowa even while the Meskwaki were still entitled to the lead mines in Dubuque. And then once they were forced out, moved in quite quickly. And he decided, and he recommended that the state basically do the same thing for African Americans, trying to keep them out. Let me move the slide. So there are a series of episodes and triumphs, what I call milestones in Iowa civil rights history that we don't have a lot of time to go into. But there are also what I call millstones as well, things that we're not so proud of, like the law, for example, that Mr. Langworthy was trying to get passed, which he's succeeded in getting passed. 1839 was the first case decided before the Iowa Supreme Court that ruled that Ralph, because he had lived in Iowa, which was part of the old, I think part of the old Northwest Territory, was free for that actual reason. A precedent that was ignored by the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1857 Dred Scott decision. With the ascendance of the abolitionist Republican Party in the 1850s, a new constitution, one that was, I brag to say, was written in Iowa City just before the capital was moved to Des Moines. A new Iowa Constitution declared in Article 1, Number 1, all men, later changed to all men and women, all men are by nature free and equal, echoing obviously the Declaration of Independence, but in this case it's in the Constitution. 1868, the Iowa Supreme Court in Clark v. Board nullifies Muscatine's public school segregation policy. It was the first successful school desegregation case in U.S. history. 1873, the Iowa Supreme Court again rules that in public conveyances, in this case a steamboat, the occupancy cannot be segregated. Emma Koger won her case against the Northwestern Union Packet Company that tried to keep her out of the dining room of the steamboat that had been reserved for whites. And then in the 20th century, before Brown v. Board versus a Brown v. Board of Education. Edna Griffin won her case for desegregating a lunch counter, and before the sit-ins of the 1960s, won her case again with the Iowa Supreme Court for desegregating Katz drugstore. So some very famous cases, primarily in the 19th century, but also the 20th century, of which we can be proud of and say, well, Iowa has a significant civil rights heritage. And part of that heritage is Alexander Clark of Muscatine, an African-American barber who played an important role in our history in the 1850s. He led a delegation of colored citizens of Muscatine County to petition repeal of what we'll talk about in just a minute, the 1851 racial exclusion law. During the Civil War, he organized African-American soldiers to volunteer for the Union Army. And of course, in 1868, he sued the city of Muscatine so his daughter, Susan, could attend an integrated school. So these are the millstones. In 1839, free blacks had to pay post a bond of $500 in order to live in the state of Iowa. 1844, only white males were permitted to serve in the legislature. 1851, Iowa passes a law forbidding blacks or mulattoes to move into the state. This was overturned in 1864 under the Republican Party that had taken over the Iowa legislature. 1857, a referendum that would grant, a public referendum that would grant African Americans the right to vote is defeated soundly, and therefore by the 1850s, whites in Iowa had removed Indians and were in the process of making it difficult for blacks to live there as well. These are the millstones. There have also been some legislative milestones in the legislature, including 1868, where there was a public referendum pushed by Republicans at that time that would assure black civil rights, including suffrage, the right to vote, which at that time was available to African American in only five other states. This was before the 14th Amendment, or the 15th Amendment, excuse me, that granted this right to blacks throughout. That in Iowa responded to Ulysses Grant, the President Grant's appeal to Iowa as the bright radical star, and did so to approve the amendments. And then in 1880, the electorate approves allowing African Americans to again serve in the Iowa legislature. So again, some milestones from the legislative side. So while these things are going on, African Americans are slowly moving to Iowa, initially on the Underground Railroad, although many formerly enslaved did not stay in Iowa. They moved through Iowa, coming up from Missouri, crossed the river into Illinois, and typically on their way to Canada. But during the Civil War in particular, as Union troops advanced, and especially after the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans began to move from the South to the North. And so during the 1860s, the population of African Americans, or the 1860s, the population of African Americans rose from about 1,000 in 1860 to almost 6,000 in 1870. And this is, and a large part of it was that as Union troops moved in through the South, taking territory, the enslaved joined the Union encampments, and the Union Army helped to move them north on steamboats and overland as well. So this was the movement, therefore, of that's depicted here in this illustration titled "Fleeing from the Land of Bondage." And so this is really sort of the third stage, the beginning of the third stage of the African American diaspora in North America. The first one being from Africa to the US, the second one being from the eastern part of the United States in 1790 westward to the western part of the South, and then Missouri, and then as these areas were developed in the West, and then thirdly during the Civil War and after the Civil War, moving to the Midwest, moving including to Iowa, and we see many of the early communities that had a growing Black population were along the Mississippi River, Keokuk, Port Madison, Mount Pleasant, the Davenport, Muscatine, a few places, Clarinda as well, and then Des Moines. This was the beginning, as I said, of sort of the third migration, which in the 20th century was associated with the so-called Great Migration, which was characterized. Jacob Lawrence is one of my favorite painters, so I had to get a Jacob Lawrence painting in here, but this deals more with the 20th century. So I'm just throwing that in there. My colleague Leslie Schwam really talks about this movement of the formerly enslaved during the Civil War and afterwards. She calls it, using the word diaspora again, she calls the movement of Blacks to the Midwest, including Iowa, emancipation's diaspora. But she also talks about the reception that Blacks received, the attitudes of white Midwesterners. And these are several quotes from her. First is, for those Midwesterners whose understanding of white supremacy had been premised on their right and ability to exclude first Native Americans and then African Americans from the region, the physical mobility of former slaves suggested an undesirable change in racial boundaries and practices in a post-slavery nation. And the Democratic Party, which was the party that was really stood pretty much with the South and with segregation and racism, said at its 1862 convention, this is the Iowa Democratic Party, they wrote, "This is the government of white men and was established exclusively for the white race, that the Negroes are not entitled to and ought not to be admitted to political or social equality with the white race." So certainly that was the reception that many whites were giving towards African Americans. After the Civil War, African Americans moved slowly to Iowa. I just did some research recently on Black farmers in Iowa. I got as far back as 1900, but in 1900, there were only 227 Black farmers or Black farm operations in Iowa, representing less than 1%, actually about 1/10 of 1% of all farms in Iowa. So as African Americans moved to Iowa, very few of them were able to break into or able to take up farming. Of course, a lot of the land by 1900 had already been settled by white Europeans. Buxton did represent, I think many people are aware of Buxton, in south central Iowa, in the coal mining region of Iowa, did represent a fleeting moment of equality while the coal lasted in that community. But by 1950, it was very clear from reports that began to be written at that time in several cities, as the civil rights movement begins to emerge in the middle of the 20th century in Iowa, that African Americans in Iowa were second-class citizens. Reports like this were written. This one was written for Burlington. This one, excuse me, this is Davenport, actually, as it says there, written by the League for Social Justice at St. Ambrose University. But similar reports were done in Burlington and Waterloo as well. Edna Griffin, whom we mentioned earlier, 1948, 1949, and her basically a sit-in long before sit-ins, 15 years before sit-ins took place in downtown Des Moines, was a civil rights pioneer. Another civil rights pioneer who is still alive is Anna Mae Weems. I believe she's 94 years old. She was a member of the United Packing House Workers of America, Local 46. UMPW was one of the pioneering locals in meatpacking in the U.S., particularly with regard to developing good race relations and including African Americans in the Union. This was something that the entire Union practiced, not just the local, but the local there was very instrumental, particularly in the 1950s, in getting African Americans, enabling African Americans to work throughout the plant, in the famous Wrath meatpacking plant, and not just in the dirtiest jobs that paid the least well. And Anna was able to get a job through that movement in the where they prepared bacon. The Black police relations have been, as we know, challenging over time. And one of the first places where they were challenged was the rise of the Black Panther movement in Des Moines in the late 1960s. That ended shortly, relatively soon after it was found, after the headquarters of the Black Panthers was bombed. But they offered, Charles Knox was part of that movement, included a free lunch program in that neighborhood. Of course, we're reminded of the Black Panthers with the Fred Hampton movie that just came out recently. Elsewhere in Des Moines was the Center Street neighborhood was the center of jazz clubs, including the Sepia Club, which is portrayed here on the right, I believe. No, actually, this is the Sepia Club. It's a Ham's Beer sign. That's a Miller sign. I knew that was. There's a Ham's Beer. Sepia Club was a famous jazz club. And if you ever Google Jazz Des Moines Sepia Club, there's a wonderful 7 or 8 minute YouTube interview with a Black musician who played there and had family members who played there as well. And so it was a major cultural center for the Black community. This case, and you know, again, the similar story, the federal government helped to work with the locals to displace the Black community, just as Native Americans had been displaced in the 19th century. This time it was through urban renewal and the interstate highway that goes through Des Moines. So if you go to what it was then the 12th, the Center Street and the 12th and Center Street area now, this is what you see. After this is, there was a pharmacy in this area, maybe I think a drugstore as well in this area, but now it's a major hospital. Hospitals are good things, but there was a neighborhood here before. Again, the diaspora, in this case, the African-American diaspora, became invisible through what the city did in this case, and really with the support of the federal government, who sponsored both the urban renewal and the interstate highway program. And so by the 21st century, really a fourth migration of the African diaspora took place, in which Illinois, for the first time, its African-American population actually declined in the first part of the 21st century. Many of the many African-Americans in the Chicago area, many of them moved south, but some of them moved elsewhere in the Midwest. They may be somewhere else in Illinois, Indiana, but some moved to Iowa as well. And when I moved here in 2008, we became aware of Chicago becoming a code for Black people. And at this time, for 2 decades of the 20th century, as more African Americans moved to Iowa, some from Chicago, but from other places as well, change began to take place, and Chicago was, as I said, used as code for Black people moving into a white community. You saw this, and still probably see this in Iowa City, Burlington, Cedar Rapids, Clinton, and Dubuque. Dubuque, which had a very, very small Black population, it grew quite quickly in the early part of the 21st century. And so this clearly posed racial challenges as well. So Iowa, as those headlines were being made about issues in Iowa City, for example, that 10 or 12 years ago, the media was all talking about the southeastern Iowa City and the problems of southeastern Iowa City, and related to African Americans moving into the community. And so this has been an issue, but it's also been an issue in terms of the outcomes, the racial outcomes. And this is a long list. Colin Gordon, a colleague of mine at the University of Iowa, has studied this for all of the Midwest, not just for Iowa. But when we look at various indicators of well-being, quality of life, Iowa doesn't compare very well when we compare ourselves to other states in terms of Black-white racial disparities. That is the ratio, and so between Black and white outcomes. So whether we're talking about incarceration or arrest rates for marijuana, or high school suspension rates or poverty rates, they all show that compared to other states, Blacks are doing less well off, or in this case, more likely to be imprisoned or to be punished relative to whites in Iowa than in other states. I mean, really, why is that? Why, given that there is discrimination and there are differential outcomes nationally, there's racism nationally, why do all these indicators make the Midwest, and particularly Iowa, look even worse than the rest of the nation? The out of school suspensions, the ratio is 6th from the last in terms of white outcomes being better than Black outcomes. Actually, in terms of college degrees, we're only 22nd from the last. But in terms of rate of employment, the Black to white ratio or the white to Black ratio is 2nd from the bottom, relative to Blacks in other states. Their position vis-a-vis whites is 2nd from the bottom in the United States. If we compare rates of unemployment, the ratio is 7th from the bottom. Home ownership, the ratio of Black to white home ownership, 7th from the bottom. Median income, 6th from the bottom. Poverty rates, 5th from the bottom. Infant mortality rates, 11th from the bottom. Incarceration rates, 3rd from the bottom. Again, this is from Colin Gordon wrote this report where a lot of this data comes from. It was published in, I think, late 2019, so relatively recently. A couple of years ago, Polk County, people in Polk County did a similar study about looking at public officials, public figures, whether they be elected officials or police officers. And again, the story is one of invisibility. At that time in Polk County, there were only 7 Black public elected officials in relatively few police officers, disproportionately small percentage of police officers. I tried to find this more recent data than 2015. I don't know whether there are any Black state patrol officers. Iowa City hired, I don't know if they were the first 2 ever, but Iowa City hired 2 Black police officers, I think 2 or 3 years ago. And they are, there was a couple of interviews done with them recently that have been posted online. But before then, before a couple of years ago, Iowa City did not have any Black police officers. So this obviously helps to contribute making African Americans invisible in the state of Iowa. This is a quote from a former director of the Center for Diversity and Enrichment at the University of Iowa, Nadine Petty. She was quoted as saying, my initial gut reaction is no, UI is not anti-Black. I think what the campus is status quo. And the status quo here on this campus is white. Then she went on to say, most of the campus community who are decision makers are white, which means most of the programming and the services and the campus focused activities are going to come from a lens that is also white. So therefore, the invisible Hawkeye seems to still be a recurring story. The third diaspora group that we want to talk about is the Hispanic or Latinx population. which has grown rapidly, certainly since the since the 1990s, early part of the 20th century. The chart on the left shows, or the figure on the left shows, a change in Hispanic population, with the bigger circles mean larger increases in population. And we see throughout the Midwest, but certainly in Iowa, very rapid increase in the Hispanic population. It is the largest, it's the fastest growing population group in the state of Iowa. In many ways attributable to meatpacking, but it also has some more historic origins as well, particularly related to beet farming, which was I don't know how many beet farms are still left in Iowa, but there used to be quite a few up in Mason City, and Mexicans in particular were migrated to work on those beet farms. And then in eastern Iowa, including Iowa City, but also the Quad Cities, with the many railroad operations in those places, Mexican Americans were brought in, particularly after 1920, to work as troqueros, working on repairing, straightening, cleaning up weeds, straightening the tracks. And so their real Latinx real first movement into Iowa was primarily in the early part of the 20th century. But more recently, it's been associated with the meatpacking towns, such as, and it's hard to read, I know, Postville, Denison, Marshalltown, Columbus Junction, Perry, West Liberty, and Storm Lake are the smaller communities, but bigger ones, of course, which with the biggest meatpacking plant would be the one in Waterloo, the Tyson plant, their biggest plant in the state, maybe the biggest in the nation. I'm trying to remember if that's the truth or not. And also in Tama, which is not shown on this map either. So this has been the recent story of Hispanic Americans, particularly since 1990, coming to Iowa. This is a map that I uncovered a couple of days ago that shows livestock plants throughout the US. And we see, we get the chance to make comparisons between Iowa and the rest of the nation. And the dark blue is poultry. There are a lot of those in the South. The light blue is cattle. There's a few in Iowa, but most of them are further west on the cattle ranges out west. It's hog farming, of course. We're a state of hogs. We have 7 hogs for every person in the state of Iowa. And these are the hog processing facilities throughout the state of Iowa. I haven't counted these blocks up. These are counties, obviously. But it seems like Iowa, certainly not surprisingly, has a concentration relative to even the Midwest in meat packing. So it's not surprising that if there is a relationship between meat packing and immigrant groups, including Hispanics, then we would see it fairly pronounced in Iowa. And so this basically talks about the Latinx population coming to Iowa, being attracted by places such as Tyson's. This is the Columbus Junction plant. And Columbus Junction is about 45 minutes southeast of Iowa City. And again, the issue of invisibility is, we see that, we observe that in some research that was done on Perry, Iowa, where there is a meat packing plant. This is a quote, I think this is quoted in my book, but I think it's from somebody else. In Perry, they felt, that is, the Hispanics felt they lived in someone else's America, and they could best cope with their hypervisibility in a small town by keeping to themselves, by becoming invisible. So very ironic, conscious of their hypervisibility, they chose to be invisible. And an example of that is in 2018, after the murder of Molly Tibbetts near Brooklyn, Iowa, and then the arrest of an Hispanic American that worked in Poweshiek County, and the fact that the person was undocumented, there was a quick, I think everybody remembers this, there was a quick sort of shudder about the impact on the Hispanic community, and a couple of Hispanic or Latino festivals were canceled, thereby increasing the invisibility. And this was one, and there was one every year in Perry, and it was canceled because of this concern in response to the wake of the Tibbetts murder and the alleged perpetrator. By the way, the trial is still going to take place, I guess in 2021 or 2022, I'm not certain. So this issue will reemerge. The Molly Tibbetts case illustrates a lot, but let me get to that in just a minute. Another aspect of invisibility, clearly, that besides the invisibility that Latinx in Americans adopt to just keep a low profile, are the immigration raids, for which Iowa has had quite a few significant ones that have gained national attention. The Swift Plant raid in Marshalltown in 2006, the famous, at that time, the largest raid in America, Postville in 2008 at agri-processors, and then more recently the raid in Mount Pleasant in 2018. And we know that immigration and concern about immigration helped to drive Trumpism. These were data from the 2016 election, and when Iowa voters were polled just before the 2016 Iowa caucuses, Iowa Republican voters were polled, the issue of immigration stood out. This is sort of like this is Trumpist Republicans, less concerned about what traditional conservatives are concerned about, government spending, more concerned about immigration. And we do know that the Trumpist won in Iowa in 2020, even though he's no longer president, did carry Iowa. So this issue clearly has not gone away. At the time of the Tibbetts murder, both Trump and Governor Reynolds wasted no time in identifying the broken immigration system as contributing to Molly Tibbetts' death. Ironically, Tibbetts' alleged murder had worked for 4 years on a large dairy farm that was owned or co-owned by Craig, I think it's Craig Lang, a major Republican operative, which reflects the sort of employer complicity in the immigration narrative. Another employer of immigrants is a dairy farmer in Western Iowa by the name of Daniel Dykstra, who wrote, according to the Des Moines Register, it's kind of a monotonous, repetitious job, especially in the milking parlor. Pretty fast-paced, smelly, dirty work. Moms don't raise their kids to be milkers. I think he might be saying white moms don't raise their kids to be milkers. It's not a glamorous job. We have 36 Mexican or Guatemalan workers and one American guy. Americans just don't want to do the work. In other words, we value the labor of whether it be as trackeros or as working in meatpacking plants of Latinos, but we don't really welcome them in any other way at all. We would, very ironic. And even though Steve King is no longer representing the state of Iowa, his association with Iowa for nearly 2 decades on the national scene, his embrace of right-wing nationalism, as indicated by his many things that he said, as well as posing for this picture with 2 European anti-Islamic political leaders, one from Germany and one from the Netherlands, indicates that this tradition of really white supremacy in Iowa and seeing Iowa as a white state continued. And then lastly, for tonight's talk, Asian Americans. And there are many, and this is a breakdown of Iowa Asian Americans. We see there are quite a mix. Chinese and Asian Indians are the largest groups, but among the other groups are the Vietnamese at 13.9%, and then the Burmese at a little bit less than 9%. As we know, Governor Ray was instrumental in opening up the state of Iowa in the 1970s to the Thai Dam ethnic minority from Vietnam in 1970, as well as the Vietnamese boat people in 1979. More recently, Iowa has become home to many refugees from Burma and also Bhutan. I'm more familiar with the Burmese population because we've interviewed some in Columbus Junction, and that our students this semester are currently working in a neighborhood in Waterloo that houses many refugees from Burma. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about them. And this is the Burmese, many of whom spent many years in refugee camps because they've been discriminated against. Many of them are Christian, but they were discriminated against by the military regime, which is, as we know, has just taken hold again. And they've spent many years in refugee camps. They're among the neediest of Iowa's immigrants, Asian or otherwise. Janet Peterson several years ago said they are by far the most neediest refugees groups that she has ever seen. In 2015, Burmese students surpassed the number of Mexican students in need of English language proficiency. Many of them, older ones, are not literate in their own language and therefore start with some real educational deficits. And they have been settled. Many of them didn't originally settle, weren't originally placed by the US government as refugees in Iowa. But they came to Iowa, we believe, I've not seen hard evidence, but we believe because they were recruited by Tyson. Tyson, of course, has plants in Waterloo and Columbus Junction. I can't remember whether the Perry plant is a Tyson plant. I should know that, but I don't recall. They too have been threatened in this case, and certainly during the Trump administration, by changes in the immigration laws. And as we know, the Trump administration put a lid on the number of refugee populations that could come to the U.S. From 85,000 refugees during the final year of the Obama administration to the 2019 cap was 18,000. I think the 2020 cap was even lower than that. I don't have that number in front of me. I think now the Biden administration is raising it to 60 or 65,000. Still not what it was during the Obama administration, but nevertheless during the Trump administration, again, the federal government acting in a way to basically shut down or disappear, if you will, another immigrant group, in this case, the Burmese, and also the Connerlys, who have also been an immigrant group coming to Iowa in recent years, again, working at meatpacking plant. This is a title page from an online article that appeared in ProPublica in December. I just read the article over the weekend. It's a detailed reporting on what happened that we all recall almost a year ago, April of last year, when many people were getting sick, many of whom were refugees, Burmese refugees, Congolese refugees, Hispanics who were working in this case, the Tyson plant in Waterloo. The same was true at the Tyson plant in Columbus Junction. And the company, of course, was very slow to respond. The state of Iowa was very slow to respond. Iowa, the workplace inspection was very slow to respond. And the result was not only many workers getting sick from COVID-19 in the plant itself, but that helped to create community spread throughout, in this case, the Waterloo community, because workers would come home and pass the illness on to the disease on to people, their family members, and some of those family members worked in nursing homes. And so the nursing home spread that existed in the Waterloo area, the community spread in nursing homes that existed in the Waterloo area was exacerbated by the fact that the Tyson plant basically had created working conditions in which people worked very close to each other. People weren't wearing masks. People weren't provided masks. They occupied very close quarters. And the company was very dragged its foot and in fact was engaging in, the managers were betting on who would get sick first. So clearly there was a cavalier attitude. You know, this is in a sense, even though we don't have the cap on refugees is being raised, this is during 2020, this was another way through the COVID illness and the way both our state as well as our corporations and the federal government treated the situation was basically allowing people to get sick because they were unimportant. They weren't they didn't count. They were invisible. And then this is a follow-up, not a story, but an article in a scientific journal, PNAS, which is available to anybody online, which makes a connection between, as it says here in yellow, our results indicate a strong positive relationship between livestock processing plants and local community transmission of COVID-19, suggesting that these plants may act as transmission vectors into the surrounding population and accelerate the spread of the virus beyond what would be predicted solely by population risk characteristics. So as we know, Blacks and Hispanics, and we believe as well, Burmese bore the brunt of COVID-19, and in part it is attributable to meatpacking plants throughout the country, but including Iowa. In fact, they estimate that roughly 6 to 8% of all U.S. cases as of July 21st were attributable to meatpacking plants, and 3 to 4% of all U.S. deaths. So this is not only significant in Iowa, it's significant in the U.S. as well. So, so yes, Iowa's population is becoming more diverse. We're about 86% white from what was once 99% white, but its whiteness was, so we're becoming more diverse. But the states, what the point is that we didn't become white by accident. It was done on purpose. It was created. It was deliberately created. And therefore, it's not going away easily. We've seen the movement of Native Americans out of the state. We've seen despite civil rights decisions by the state courts, we've seen efforts legally to keep African Americans out. We've seen the use of federal renewal and federal urban renewal and federal highway programs to dislocate African Americans in Des Moines. We've seen the use of immigration raids by the federal government to frighten and scare off Hispanic Americans in the state of Iowa. And we've seen now both COVID-19 as well as the Trump refugee policies attempting to put a lid on other groups, including Asian Americans coming to Iowa. So the federal government has been basically complicit in a variety of ways, as has the state of Iowa itself. Almost done. So Iowa's at a crossroads. Iowa's becoming a more diverse state, but in its representation, how it presents itself, Iowa still feels like a white state in which other groups are made invisible. But to participate in a global world and to address its labor shortages, and we all know that Iowa has significant labor shortages, Iowa must become a more diverse state in order to grow its population. After all, the population groups that are growing are the non-white groups. And so if Iowa does indeed really want to grow, and if it wants to grow its communities, it needs to do a better job of embracing its diverse communities and not doing otherwise. But to do so, it must deal progressively and proactively with the ways in which it has continued to remain a white state in both reality and perception. So that's open now for questions. And I think they're going to be read to me. Is that how we're going to do that?
They are. Pastor Smith is going to start with the first question.
Okay, good.
Okay, here we go. First question is, how do you see the Black Lives Matter movement impacting rural and the more urban parts of Iowa?
Well, yeah, clearly it's clearly a very important movement, and it's and we're also facing backlash against it right now. It doesn't. Those of us who lived through the 1960s know about observing backlash to the civil rights movement at that period of time. As we all know, the Iowa legislature is focused on backing the blue, but the anti-racial profiling law or bill that was recommended by the governor is not making any headway. So there was a lot of excitement, as we all know, last summer, including in Iowa. And there were a number of smaller communities that are not completely white. There was an article in the New York Times about that. I don't remember which community they profiled, but it was a smaller Iowa community in which there were marches and demonstrations on behalf of Black Lives Matter. And it was well received, but it seems now that we are in the midst of a backlash. I do really, one of the things I observed with admiration, I hope to see more of it, former University of Iowa graduate and Grinnell College faculty member Keisho Scott embarked on a series of speaking engagements in small towns in Iowa. I'm not sure how many she went to altogether, but I know she came to Washington, Iowa. We live near Washington, Iowa, in the town square, and heard a wonderful speech talking about Black Lives Matter. I don't know if she converted anybody at that time, or maybe it was the people who were already converted like ourselves that were there. But it's certainly in our urban areas, and I can speak most directly about Iowa City. It's having a positive impact, and we are trying to move forward. But I think, I frankly think the legislature is sending a chill throughout the state. Certainly what happened with the Ames School District. So I don't know how good I feel about the situation. I know there was a lot of strong feeling that we need to do more, we need to do a better job, and certain communities are doing a better job. But I've been told, I have not verified this, but I've been told that the University of Iowa is a little hesitant to make any bold moves on various initiatives with regard to what we call DEI, diversity, engagement, inclusion, or equity inclusion, because they're waiting for the legislative session to end. I don't know if that's true or not, and if somebody maybe on the call can contradict that, but there is a fear at the university that that I've not seen before. This is my 13th year here. This is the most palpable that I've seen this fear, and I think we've got to overcome it.
All right. The next question is, has anyone looked at the ways that the communities in which the meatpacking plants are located actively dissuade immigrants from assimilating or integrating into the wider community, or who the children are also socially and academically held back? What are the internal messages in the plants, if you know, or in the immigrant populations that maintain this segregation? Do the children who grow up in the community stay, or are they able to move beyond?
Yeah, those are all really good questions. I know in the case of Perry, the literature that I read suggests that it's, there is, there's always this sense of feeling like they are strangers in a strange land, that they're not fully welcome. They're welcome for their work, but they're not welcome to be your neighbor. I think this is a challenge. West Liberty probably is the exemplar in this area, and it's because they embraced language. They saw that the Spanish language, speaking Spanish is something that, as well as speaking English, is something that, you know, everybody can agree on. And so they created their dual language program, their K through 12 dual language program there in the late 1990s. It's voluntary, and not everybody participates in it. But I think it's done a lot to encourage people. It really makes it more attractive to move into that community. And I think it helps that community a lot in terms of achieving a degree of people learning to get along with each other and appreciate each other's culture. So I think they've been more successful in that regard, maybe than I would say certainly than Columbus Junction has. The people that I've interviewed in Columbus Junction really enjoy that community, but they don't, they don't exactly look, that I've talked to at least, don't look to the school district to play the kind of leadership role that certainly the school district in West Liberty played.
Okay. Next question is, would it be fair to say that the reason Iowa is so white is that by design, will that whiteness make Iowa more susceptible to white supremacy recruiting?
I think the fact that I don't know if it's more susceptible, but I guess it's pretty susceptible given the fact that it's a pretty white state. So yeah, I think its whiteness does contribute to that, both again the perception of it as well as the actual fact. I didn't mention it, but you know, so many parts of the state of Iowa, you rarely see anybody who is non-white, and so you can, in many parts of Iowa, you feel like, or you can feel like you're living in an entirely white state. The title of that chapter 4, "Why is Iowa so white?" Is indirectly attributable to the experience of one of my African-American colleagues at the university. I talk about this in the book. We went on a 3-day field trip to central and north central Iowa, ending up in Des Moines, going up north via Marshalltown. In the 3 days, including even in Des Moines, we were just in Des Moines overnight, she didn't see one African-American person the whole time. And it was sort of like, and so it's possible to be in the state, or like I said, be on the University of Iowa campus and see very few people that are not that are African-American or Hispanic. It's changing a little bit, but it's still, in fact, I contrast that to my experience at Florida State University. I taught at Florida State from 1981 to 2008. And the difference on campus during that period of time was palpable. 1981, you saw very few Black students. By 2008, you saw a lot of Black students. I mean, it was just really almost a different place. Still predominantly white, but it was much more integrated setting. Now, Florida has has a much larger Black population, so it was a matter of recruiting African Americans. Iowa has a harder time doing that because of its perception as a white place, and the university has a hard time doing that.
This next one is, I'm going to actually combine this one with a question we got beforehand. So this question is about, to what extent has redlining prevented people of color from owning homes, attending better schools, being settled in order to open businesses? In what forms, official or unofficial, does redlining continue? And this person is specifically interested in Davenport, Bettendorf, and Pleasant Valley, but we also had a question come in beforehand about barriers to Black farm ownership as well.
Okay.
What kind of barriers were in place? So if you want to answer all of those.
All of the above. All right. So redlining. Yeah, redlining has gotten a lot. It's funny. Redlining has gotten more traction in the last few years than it ever did before, partly because of the well, the discovery actually was that they were discovered about almost 50 years ago, but the rediscovery of these redlining maps that were done by the federal government in the 1930s in the larger cities, 1930s and early 1940s. And you can go online and, for example, and find redlining, federal redlining maps for Waterloo, Des Moines. I don't know about Cedar Rapids, as well as many large cities throughout the country. And in many cases, there is a correlation between those neighborhoods that were outlined in red, often because they were African American, and current neighborhoods that are predominantly poor and maybe African American, maybe Hispanic. So seems to be a perpetuation, therefore, of poverty, of lacking in good public services and things of that sort. So those maps don't, they impacted federal housing policy between the 1940s really and the 1960s. They don't anymore, but banks are still accused of practicing redlining, even though it is illegal. It was made illegal in the 1968 Fair Housing Act, but they are still accused of doing that. And there is evidence to suggest that they do practice discrimination. And we know that discrimination, it's a little bit easier to discover, but discrimination in the sale or rental of housing still takes place. Unfortunately, Iowa, as far as I know, doesn't do much in the way of with racial testing in housing. And by that I mean taking two people, in this case, let's say one white and one black, matching them up. They in a sense play a role. They both play 35-year-old people with a college education and a good job, making the same income. They go to the same realtor, or they go to the same apartment building, respond to the same advertisement, and then compare, or the comparison is made in terms of how well they're treated or not. That is really the only way to discern the degree to which discrimination is taking place. Discrimination, and this includes redlining, the people who do it have gotten much better at it, frankly. And it's now it's called discrimination with a smile. You don't get your door slammed in your face. Somebody smiles, but then they tell you that house has already been sold. There's still racial steering that goes on as well. Again, the most recent interesting, well, there's national data on this, but there was a great series of articles in the Long Island newspaper. What is it called? Newsday. They did an expose and there's a video for that. If you go to Newsday, I think it's Fair Housing. Wonderful expose done in 2019, so relatively recently, and comparing the experiences of blacks and whites in places like Levittown on Long Island in the unequal treatment. So I don't know that there's been any research that's been done on that in the Quad Cities area. I'm not aware of any research that's been done on that, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. What was the other part of that question? It was about agriculture. Yeah. Yeah. As I said, from what I can tell, there were never many black owned farms in Iowa, going back as far as 1900. I haven't gone back into the latter part of the 19th century yet to look that up. Currently, and I was just looking at these, in fact, I got to make sure I get my numbers right. As of the 2017 census, agricultural census, which is the most recent one, there were 69 black farms or black owned farms in the state of Iowa, 69 in comparison to, I think it's 115,000 white owned or white farmers. So roughly Black farmers account for 0.6% of farms in the state of Iowa. A very clearly a very, very small percentage, which if you've ever wondered, well, are there any Black farmers in the state of Iowa? I say, well, I've never seen any. If it's only 0.6%, you probably, whatever it is, you probably would not see it. It's a very, very small number. Now, is that on purpose or is that an accident? In the book, I really don't talk about Black agriculture, but I do talk about Blacks living in small towns in Iowa, because many African Americans, when they moved to Iowa, some moved to Des Moines, but in the latter part of the 19th century, many of them moved to smaller communities, but gradually moved to larger communities. Now some say they moved because the jobs were in the big cities, but others adopt the sundown town critique, which was definitely true in Illinois, where basically Blacks were told that they couldn't be in town after sundown. Right. I know that was true of the Southern Illinois town that my father grew up. He told me about it. Iowa, the fellow that wrote the book, who's I'm sure somebody on this call knows the name of that book about sundown towns. He identifies many communities in Illinois for which that's true. In Iowa, his evidence is pretty sparse. It's mostly it's rumors that some towns, but he presents really no hard evidence that very many Iowa towns were formerly sundown towns. One of the communities I look at in the book, and there's a PhD student here at Iowa that he's done some research on Newton, Iowa, and we're still trying to figure out Newton. Newton's Black population began to grow after the Civil War as and this is his research, not mine, as Black Civil War veterans moved to Newton. Some of the people individuals that were among the Union troops, fought in the Union Army, moved to Iowa, moved to Newton. And I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but there was a significant population by 1900 in Newton. But gradually over time, the population began to get smaller and smaller. And what's ironic, the population of Blacks in Newton gets smaller at the same time that a certain industry begins to take off in the beginning of the 20th century, Maytag. And so the question is, why, because it would be said about African Americans, they moved to the big cities because that's where the jobs were. That's where the industrial jobs were. Well, obviously Maytag was an industrial employer. Why weren't Blacks working there? Why weren't they staying in Newton? A good friend of mine who graduated from Newton High School in 1972 could only recall one African American in his high school class. So since then, the Black population of the county, Jasper County, has grown. But by the middle of the 20th century, it apparently was pretty small. Why is that? Were they driven out, or did they voluntarily move out?
I think we have time for a couple more. Tony, you want to pick another one?
Yeah, this one is kind of piggybacks off what where you were just saying, and I'm going to read for the person that wrote it. I'm going to read it backwards because the question comes at the end.
Oh, okay. All right, good.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Okay, good.
Yeah. So rural communities are dying and need to be revitalized, but strong racist sentiments held by rural Iowans are a detriment to anyone coming in who is not white. What can Iowa do to encourage racial minorities to move into rural areas?
Well, I think, and maybe, if you reverse the way the question was asked, I'll reverse the way my answer is, or, what can small communities do to embrace minorities and welcome them and attract them? I won't name this community, but we have a group of students working in a small community this year. We have several communities that our students are working in. This is a team of five students. Three of whom are I think that's right. 3 of whom are persons of color, and one from Africa, one from Asia, and it may be 2 persons of color. Anyhow, we were talking with the city manager and several other people. We had a wonderful day. We rode our bicycles. We stayed outside. We didn't go indoors. We wore our mask and everything. This was back in August. And so we had ridden around the town, and, you know, like many Iowa towns, you didn't see anybody but white people. So this one student said, you know, where are the minorities? You know, and what we heard was, well, there are very few that live here. They are welcome here. And then it was said, but they would have to assimilate. Well, in some respect, there's your answer. If you have to become like the people in this community that looks pretty different than you, and then why would you want to move on those terms? Why can't you be yourself? Again, it relates to this theme of invisibility. If you have to make yourself invisible, or someone else, then you're making yourself invisible. So that's not the way to approach it. I'm anxious to see what the students say in their final report, because really, I mean, the town wants to grow. Like most Iowa small towns, they want to grow, but are they willing to do what is necessary in order to grow, not just to attract that plant that will bring in refugees or Hispanics and pay them low wages, but to make it possible, like West Liberty has, for people to get a good quality education as well.
All right, we'll do at least 1 or 2 more. Since the pandemic, hate crimes toward Asian Americans are increasing, and some of our international students have been bullied. As a community member, what can we do?
Oh, yeah, this is really, yeah, we need to stand up. We need to, you know, we need to stand out and stand up in support of our Asian brethren. We can't just let this be about Asians. We need to be allies, in other words. And we need to put, you know, and we need to apply that same philosophy to all groups that are being victimized at one time or another. Sorry.
No, that's good. All right, Tony, you have 1 more. It's hard to pick. So just so you know, Dr. Connerly has agreed to also answer some of these afterwards. So if you submitted a question tonight that doesn't get answered, he's graciously agreed to do some of that afterward too. So
do I have to stay up all night to do that?
It doesn't have to be tonight.
Good.
We'll send you them. Do you have 1 more you want to get in, Tony?
Well, I found 1 more. Let's see, it says, how is new voting? How is the new voting legislation designed to limit voting access tied to promoting and maintaining whiteness, white supremacy in Iowa?
Well, you again, getting back to that hearing that took place last week when the representative from our neighboring county here in eastern Iowa took offense when he cited a piece of literature that was part of the training. I don't think it was actually part of what students read, but it was part of the training materials for the teachers, that said that voter suppression was a, you know, part of the long chapter that we've had in voter suppression and voting denial. Took offense at that because he says, you know, he said, you're saying that I'm a racist. Yeah, I don't know what to say in response to that, but maybe if he doth protest too much. That what other reason are there? I mean, that party won. They won handily. There was no problems with voting integrity in Iowa or any other place, but certainly in Iowa. What other explanation is there? I mean, they do want to win elections, but I mean, there is another explanation. This is part of a national movement to support Trumpism as well, but it is still race-based, as we know, because Trumpism is race-based.
It is.
Let the transcript show that I said race-based, not race-paced. Oh, I said it again. I'm sorry, I get a kick out of these transcripts. Anything else? We got another question?
I think Tony's going to wrap it up for us.
Okay.
Yep.
And then,
Okay.
and then I'll say a couple words.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Dr. Connerly, for all this great information, all the history that you've given us, and how you've unveiled and revealed to us Iowa's history, and it gives us the opportunity, and it challenges us. I believe that it challenges us as a panel and as in the audience to create change. And my challenge to the audience now is a famous quote that Joe Madison says. I don't know if you heard of him or not, but he's an activist and now a talk show host. And he says, and his quote is he says, "What are you going to do about it?" And that's the challenge that I believe that we have leaving here today, and that things that you want to ask yourself about is what are you going to do about it? Will you take ownership of creating change in Iowa, or will you be complicit and just allow things to be the same way that they've always been? I believe just because you've gotten on this call, on this webinar, that there is something in you that says that you believe that change should happen. And so I'd like to see you take responsibility. How do you do that? We organize, we mobilize, and to create change. And so whatever it is that you need to do, and my organization, Johnson County Interfaith Coalition, the Beloved Community, we would be ready, willing, and able to assist you in those efforts.
And I want to second the thanks for you being with us, Dr. Connerly. If you can't see how a system was put together, it's hard to see how to dismantle it. So it's really useful to see how all those pieces were put into place. And thank you for giving us permission to share a recording of this webinar with any groups that would like to use it afterward. The recording will be posted online sometime tomorrow, and we hope that you share it widely and that it continues to generate good conversation in whatever circles you're in. We would normally pay an honorarium to our guest speaker, but Dr. Connerly has asked that it be donated, and so we'll be sending a donation to Dream City here in Iowa City in Thanksgiving for your time with us. If you're interested in purchasing the book that this chapter we heard about tonight is from, I did put the name of the book in the chat. Somebody asked, Dr. Connerly, is it available at Prairie Lights?
Yes, it is.
I assumed so. And then if you'd like to support the work of Beloved Community Initiative, we would welcome that as well, so that we can continue to offer programming like this and other educational opportunities. becomingbelovedcommunity.org. You can find the schedule of our upcoming offerings and find out more about the ministry that we do. Blessings on the rest of your evening, and thank you for joining us tonight.